Welcome to episode number 7 of the Corner Booth podcast. This time coming to you from Green Spot Restaurant on the heart of Notre Dame on a Sunday afternoon. Myself, Aaron Rand, along with Leslie Chesterman and Bill Brownstein, and the Canada correspondent for the New York Times, Dan Bilefsky, who happens to live in Montreal. Dan, thanks for being
Born
here.
in Montreal.
Born and raised, and living here now.
Thanks for having me.
So, I guess what we should start with is the thing that's gotten you told us that before we started this, the most hate mail you've received in a long time. And that's a piece that you wrote the other day about Bill 96. So let's do a little bit of backtracking. First of all, why that in the New York Times? And was there the kind of reaction you thought there would be?
In terms of why it's in the New York Times, the language issue is a global issue. Dozens of states have actually enacted legislation in the United States making English the official language. It's an issue in other countries like France and Belgium. So it's something that really resonates with international readers. At the same time, having grown up in Montreal, an Anglophone who's bilingual, the issue is also very personal to me. And I came home here, back here a few years ago after 28 years abroad, and it's been interesting to me to see how the cultural music has shifted in the past several decades since I left.
Can I just, to follow up on that, so you're from here, you're born here, you've traveled or you've worked around the world. In you coming back, had you noticed a shift in how things are here?
Very much so. So just to put it in perspective, I came of age in Montreal in the late 70s and early 80s. It was a time of very loud culture wars, on the eve of the referendum, mass exodus of people and businesses to Toronto. And when I came back about 4 years ago after 3 decades away, I found that the situation had shifted here quite radically. The younger generation were no longer interested to the same extent in their internecine language battles of their boomer parents. They much more wanted to be like the next Québécois, Bill Gates, than to make revolution. And I found Montreal a much more cosmopolitan city than the Montreal I left in the 1990s. Having said that, the latest language debate has reminded me that a lot of the same issues that divide and polarize the city and the country still very profoundly remain.
I'm interested because you spent time in Paris, did you not?
Yes, I was the Paris correspondent back in the day, and I lived in Paris about a total of 7 years.
So how come issues like the language, I've spent a lot of time in Paris, Leslie has, you have, issues like this don't crop up there, but why is it here that we get so bogged down and are so upset? Your piece about the Anglo bookstore run by a Franco, I found that shocking because you go to Paris, you find some great English bookstores. There's nobody goes in there with masks on. Nobody gets irate. Why is it?
Well, France is a large country of off the top of my head, 60 million people with a large national ego, and Quebec is a province of 8 million people surrounded by English majority North America, where the demographics are stacked against Francophones in terms of the future of the language. So there's a real visceral, emotional fear that French will be overtaken. Having said that, I wouldn't agree completely that it's not an issue in France. The Académie Française does police language. Several years ago, they tried to ban the word hashtag, for example, and they're kind of worried about certain Englishisms invading the French language. Same thing in Belgium. But I think obviously Quebec is a very particular place because Quebec is surrounded by North America, and the lingua franca is English, and popular culture is English, and social media is English. So I think, the Québécois Francophones have a reason to be concerned about the future of the language.
But what I find fascinating is our families, people who have stayed here, are more in touch with the French than ever before. The generations before us, they all left for Toronto. The Anglos that stayed here, they're fully bilingual. My kids, they speak French as well as anybody, and I don't see it as threatened as some powers.
You could argue that a lot of people would argue among both sides that Bill 101 has been a stunning success.
Yeah.
You go into a dépanneur in Montreal, and the second-generation immigrants selling you the Diet Coke is speaking Québécois French. I went into a Hungarian sweet shop on Rachel Est, where I live, a few days ago, and it was a young, second-generation Hungarian immigrant who spoke perfect Québécois French. I think at the same time, Bill 101, because a lot of Anglophones have learned French and the immigrants have learned French, it's brought a lot of Quebecois closer to Anglophone culture and to American culture. And paradoxically, it's had the paradoxic effect of making maybe Quebecois more outward-looking in a globalized world, and that also arguably can be a threat to the future of the French language. And that's what a lot of Quebecois people say to me.
I think that there's also the argument that we talk a lot about language, but Dan, you just said the key word, which is also culture. And I think that the creeping American culture, look, it's. I've always made the argument as an Anglophone mother of two kids, American culture infiltrates our house greatly. There is a lot more American culture in our house than Canadian culture or Quebecois culture. So I think it's also a battle to preserve their culture through language. And yet, there's so many arguments with this bill, which actually, when it first came up, I thought it really had less of a reaction from Anglophones because we read it and we said, oh, we're so relieved that it's not worse for the Anglophone community, but in many ways, it is not good for Francophones, especially young Francophones who want to study in English. CEGEP, which they're not dropping, the government, or I wouldn't even say the government, I would say French media and a lot of, separatist columnists are, very adamant. Denise Bombardier, that the premier here is, shirking away from taking that big step of making. And for people who don't know, CEGEP, which is junior college here, which Francophone kids are allowed to attend in English, they want to make it, once again, that Francophones must attend because a lot of them are going to English CEGEP. So this bill and this situation here is really something when you tear it apart.
You point out in the piece that you wrote, Dan, that the fear now again, here we are from 1977, from the first Bill 101 to here when Bill 96 eventually passes. The thing that doesn't get talked about, at least it's starting to now, is the fact that businesses, never mind individuals, businesses are looking at this and saying, wait a sec, this doesn't augur very well for our future. Are we going to see, is the worry that we see that exodus of businesses again, should this bill go through the way it is now, that we did 40 some odd years ago?
I think this is a real fear from the business community on both sides, which I've been hearing. Under the bill, businesses will have to justify hiring someone who speaks a language other than French, which conceivably means that if you're a multinational working in Montreal, your staffing decisions could be determined by Quebec bureaucrats. And obviously, in a globalized world in 2021, businesses don't want to make decisions worrying about that hovering over them. So I have been hearing complaints from the business community that this could deter investment and spook people from coming to Montreal. I think it remains to be seen what happens, and at this moment we're still at the stage of alarmism from both sides, and the bill hasn't passed yet, and we're not exactly sure what's going to happen. But in a globalized world, and when companies are looking at cities to invest in, obviously if your staffing decisions could be determined by bureaucrats and you can't hire people who you want to hire, of course it can impact. And what I started to say is that Montreal has gained a reputation as a center for high technology and the video game industry, and a lot of startups are coming here. So there is a chance that obviously this could spook investors. But I would also say the corollary of that is that Quebecois sources say to me that they're frustrated about going into the streets of Montreal and not finding service in French when they go into certain businesses, let's say in the West Island of the city. So I think it also cuts both ways vis-a-vis this language bill.
What is the perception Americans, New Yorkers, have of Quebec? I mean, do they see any of this? Do they hear any of this? You get stories about them coming up and people not speaking to them in English. I'm curious.
I think most people globally, and I've lived in Paris, London, Brussels, Istanbul, Prague, and New York, Montreal punches above its weight on the global stage. It's a city with a very vibrant culinary scene. Anthony Bourdain used to like to come here. And I think a lot of people know Montreal for this sort of the cowboy excess of our food and the fun of our nightlife. And then I think they also think of Montreal and Canada as a slab of Scandinavia on top of the United States. So I think when they read my stories sometimes about the language issue and how polarizing it is, they are surprised that this is happening north of the border, because they tend to think of Montreal as this kind of fun place you go to
Paris
party.
of North America.
The Paris of North America, although having lived in Paris, I've always thought that is a little bit unfair to Paris, but no, I think people really love Montreal, and they're a little bit surprised at how polarizing the issue is.
But also, to be fair, the fact that Quebecers are fighting to preserve their language and their culture is they are fighting to preserve a lot of what makes this place unique.
1,000%. And I remember someone saying to me, if it wasn't for the French, Montreal would be like Pittsburgh. So
a small Toronto, maybe.
It's true that Montreal has its cachet from the French. And I also think that Montreal is not le Québec profond. The people who the CAQ are appealing to is not multicultural, multilingual Montreal. So when American tourists come here, they're very much welcomed in multiple languages. Part of why we have Bonjour, hi, which I know can be painful to a French ear. But I think Montreal is a very welcoming city, and most Americans feel very welcome here.
Did people understand that whole Bonjour hi situation when you say to someone, when you come to Montreal, there was an actual debate, a political point raised in the National Assembly to outlaw the word hi at the end of bonjour?
I did a story about it for the New York Times, and it actually, the resolution passed 2 days after I had returned to Montreal after 3 decades away. And I felt a surreal sense of déjà vu, like, oh my goodness, nothing has changed. So I think for an American sensibility, because the United States is such a constitutional rights culture, people are very surprised that a legislature would try and legislate speech, even though that was a non-binding resolution. Right. But I think the optics of it were quite surprising to an American audience. But I also understand to a Quebecois, Francophone audience who are trying to preserve their language, the fact that English has entered the Quebec vernacular in such a stunning way can be anathema to some people. At the same time, so much of Quebecois French is the playful mix of English and French expressions that sort of linguistic purists who rail against Bonjour hi, I think in a way are negating how wonderfully kind of playful Quebecois French is when it comes to language wafting from across the border.
Unique in a sense, because you don't have that, I'm guessing, in a place like Paris.
Pardon me?
Those Anglicisms don't exist in a place like Paris,
do
they?
Do
they?
Not to the same extent. I mean, because there's been a long history of Anglicisms invading across the border to Montreal because of physical proximity.
Right.
Because of global popular culture, you get English coming to France as well. But Montreal is one of the few places, for example, where you have franglais hip-hop artists who rap in English and French. You have that in other places in the world. But in Montreal, they actually combine French and English in the same stanza, where they'll go 2 words in French, 2 words in English. And it's actually like a brilliant new way of communicating that is so Montrealais.
When you go outside the city into the greater Quebec, what kind of reaction do you get from people meeting you, and what is your reaction to the world out there? Completely different from Montreal.
So one of the things I did when I came back to Montreal after 3 decades away was I did a road trip across Quebec, where I asked people to tell me where I should go and who I should meet, and I had a massive response among Francophone Quebecois. And I went really all the way to Saguenay, and I found people incredibly welcoming and open, and I found the younger generation did not have hang-ups when it came to language. I went to actually a high school in Quebec City where young people spoke excellent English, and I asked them why that was. Part of it was that, it was a very good school, but part of it was from playing video games with other kids in China and Russia, and because of globalization and social media, these younger generation kids had embraced being multilingual. So actually it was quite eye-opening to me. It wasn't at all what I was expecting.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I read your article, my reaction towards Bill 96 changed, and I thought when you look at it, it is not just about preserving the French language, it's about kind of, I think, snuffing out bilingualism. Because when you start talking about education or the language of commerce, and you're just saying we want it all to be French, and there's some columnists who would be very happy if Montreal was 100% French, which, you can respect that, but on the other hand,
I'm
the
sure
reality...
some politicians as well who would be happy with
absolutely. But the reality of Montreal, especially for people like us who, I've been here for 54 years, give or take, is that this is a bilingual city, and there was even an article by Jean-François Lisée yesterday in The Devoir saying that if there was a referendum on whether or not the city was bilingual, it would win overwhelmingly. The reality here is that if they really want to, get rid of the English here, there's a lot of work to do, and there are a lot of people here who are happy to speak both languages. Behind us in this restaurant is a banquette with 6 kids, and they're speaking English and French right now. So also Bill 101 made a lot of the Anglophones bilingual, but they don't seem to want to make the Francophones bilingual for fear that it will threaten their language.
That's true, but I would also add a lot of Quebecois friends and readers have written to me to complain that Anglophones in Montreal and Quebec want bilingualism. This country is supposed to be officially bilingual, but when you go to the rest of Canada and you're Francophone,
right,
it can be very hard to get service in French, and it's more like an aspiration than a reality. So I think that obviously upsets a lot.
That's an argument that comes up all the time, but it's a difficult argument because it's very hard to say that if you go to Calgary, service should be in both languages, and then you'll say, well, if you're the minority in Calgary, you should have the same rights as the minority in Quebec.
Yeah, so that's a good argument in theory, but not in practical terms, because the Montreal is a bilingual city, has been this way forever. It didn't just suddenly happen 5 or 10 years ago. I'm curious about one other thing, which is this idea, and you mentioned something, Leslie, a little while ago about this bill, Bill 96, which you cite in the article. It's 200 and some odd pages long. I think when it first came out, the problem was we looked at this thing just on the surface and thought, oh, this doesn't look all that bad. I remember thinking to myself, oh, there's a couple of things in here, but it's not that bad. And then you had hearings a couple of weeks ago where people went up to make their points, and you started hearing from engineers, doctors, all of a sudden all these people who invested here looking at this bill saying, wait a sec, if this passes as is, we're in a lot of trouble. And I think that's the part that's now making people sort of sit back and say, wait a sec, we need to look at this even more closely than we did at the beginning. So in you writing about this, I'm curious about people who wrote you after having read this. What was their main argument? Was there a thread or a consensus to what the opinion was?
Unfortunately, for better or for worse, the issue of language is so divisive and polarized in Quebec that I heard anger, support from both sides. One thing I would say is it's worth noting that a majority of Quebecers support Bill 96, and so in all likelihood, it should pass. And then the second thing, I think I heard a lot from the business community. Under the law, language inspectors would have the right to inspect smaller and medium-sized businesses, including investigating and looking at computers and iPhones without having a search warrant. So a lot of constitutional lawyers and business people are concerned about that particular aspect of the law because they have invoked the so-called notwithstanding clause that would allow the legislation to pass while breaching certain aspects of the Charter of Freedoms and Rights, including freedom of expression, which would otherwise protect some forms of search such as that. So I've heard that quite a bit. But I mean, depending upon who you talk to, people have very polarized reactions to that, to my stories and to the bill.
You brought up a very interesting point about globalization. Ultimately, the world is doomed to that. I mean, ultimately, we're going to be in a position where it's basically one language, one way of thinking, because that's the way the world is going. And I don't know how you get around that. I mean, as much as we want to protect languages, I want to protect French, whatever, any language, I think ultimately the world is going to come to that.
But do you not sense, I mean, to Bill's point, that people who are maybe against this don't understand that globalization is not going to get smaller, it's only going to get bigger? That's where we're going?
I think people who support the bill would argue that when you look at the demographics of slowing birth rates, a larger proportion of aging population among Francophones and Quebec, and the pervasiveness of English in popular culture and social media, that's why you need to have legislation to protect the future of French. And I think that's what supporters of the bill would say in response to that. So yes, globalization is here to stay. People would argue that that's precisely why you need legislation to protect the language. And that's in fact what proponents of the bill testified during the legislative debates.
You know, we talk about the word polarization, but there's a new phenomenon that's coming, which is a lot of, again, Francophone media is writing about how people from outside of the city of Montreal now feel uncomfortable coming to Montreal because it's a city that's English and they don't feel comfortable here. And yet when I hear about the, repercussions of Bill 96, when you're talking about looking at people's phones, I think the opposite. I mean, I have been in places in Montreal, ranging from a dinner party with 100% Francophones to just being at the local market where I felt uncomfortable actually speaking English. I'm not kidding. So when I hear people saying that they're Francophones saying they're not comfortable in the English city of Montreal, as an English Montrealer, I sometimes don't feel comfortable in my own city. I was so surprised to read that because even on the street that I grew up in, it was a completely Anglophone neighborhood, and now there's only one Anglophone family on my street, and it was 100% Anglophone. I mean, we see that everybody sees the city differently according to where they live and the experience they had. But when I read this, that Francophones feel uncomfortable coming to Montreal, I was floored. I mean...
Look, I with respect to, Francophones feeling threatened, I think we all, one of the considerations if this bill passes, and it looks like obviously it will, is the fact that this emboldens people who, and they've always been around, who will simply say to you, parle-moi en français.
Yeah.
Right? I don't even want to make an attempt to speak English because you shouldn't be speaking English to me. And by passing a bill like this, those people and others like them will simply feel it's okay to say that to Anglos.
Even more polarizing than
exactly.
before.
At the end of the day, it becomes more polarizing. I wonder if you think that, Dan, if this is, it's funny, you reference the people behind us speaking English and French casually back and forth, which a lot of people can do. The politicizing of this bill, as opposed to what's really going on in the streets of the city. You think that's dividing people in and of itself?
And the media, too, by the way. Yeah.
I think you have to remember, one has to remember that the CAQ, their base is not Montreal. And Montreal is a multilingual place, and one need only go outside and hear bonjour, hi, and hear the babel of languages, people going effortlessly between English, French, and Arabic, whether you're in a restaurant or you're on a bike path in the plateau. So I actually think that the politicization is happening because the government is not addressing people in Montreal. They're addressing people outside of Montreal. And so this is actually a bill that's polarizing between urban and rural, between cosmopolitan internationalists and a perhaps more nationalist point of view. And so it's tapping into a lot of social and political currents that we're seeing in Quebec and Canada, but we're seeing these all over the world, in Europe, where people are increasingly, becoming more concerned about the preservation of their national identities and language. But this is a bill that really polarizes. I think it talks about two different Quebecs, the Montreal and the rest of Quebec.
And immigration, of course, which is a big part of this issue as well.
1,000%.
And of course, you saw the message this week. I don't know if we saw that the ad that the CAQ put together that's running on French TV, by the way, that basically says, my language is what defines me, or my language is what defines a Quebecer. And I thought on seeing that, what does that say to everybody else here who is not a Francophone?
Well, proponents of the bill say to me that the language that people speak at home is very important for the future of a language. If my memory is correct, about 55% of immigrants in Quebec speak French at home and 44% speak English. And so the fear is that gap will narrow in the years to come, and therefore you need language protections.
Yeah, and then the question always comes up, why does this have to be a zero-sum game? Why does protection of French have to work against the protection of any kind of English here at all? And I'm just wondering, when you hear from readers, you said you got a lot of comments on that particular piece. Did someone bring that point up? The fact that why are Anglos always the ones singled out here with respect to protecting and promoting French? I mean, if we all sat here together, we would all say, hey, we like French, we want to protect French as well.
We could do it in French.
We could.
We could do the
promote
podcast
it.
in French.
But it basically looks at us as the enemy. And I don't really understand why that's the case. Did you hear from readers about that?
I think all I could say on that is that the reaction has been so polarized that it suggests to me that on both sides, they're sort of throbbing at the mouth, overreactionary, emotional reactions to the whole thing on both sides.
Yes.
And I think we have to guard against alarmism within the Anglophone community as well when it comes to these kinds of bills, and try and see things from the Francophone point of view as well.
There's a certain
I heard that from a lot of Francophone friends and readers who wrote to me.
There's a certain sense of whimsy as well. I mean, I love speaking French.
Yeah.
I mean, I love going to Paris. I could never leave here for Toronto or anywhere else. And I find myself in conversations more and more speaking French to Anglos who also are speaking French because we don't know.
That's a Montreal phenomenon.
I have they don't know what language. I mean, I can fake it, I guess, well enough, and they can, and we have no idea that we're both Anglos speaking French together.
Absolutely.
And I mean, I find that fun and interesting.
It's very, very Montreal. I think, certainly from a personal perspective, being bilingual and being, fairly fluent in French has been a huge advantage in my life, in my career, and my travels, and I wouldn't trade that for the world. And I certainly find among my younger Quebecois friends, they really value being multilingual on the global stage, because most of them have the same aspirations of any younger people working anywhere, and they want to travel and they want to work, and people want to be able to speak both languages. And frankly, I think they will. You cannot legislate what's in people's hearts and minds, and you cannot legislate the language of the street. I think that's one of the challenges of the bill, and I think a lot of people from both sides said that to me, that the reality in 2021 with popular culture, with social media, with the Spanish, French, and Anglophone waiter working in the same restaurant where we're sitting now in St. Henry, legislation is going to have a hard time changing what people speak at home or in a restaurant. People are going to speak what they're going to speak.
It's funny, and not to do with your column, but as I'm listening to you talk, I think back to this whole thing that started in the Journal de Montréal article that said that claimed after a investigative report, they discovered that they couldn't get served in French in downtown Montreal stores, and listed some of the places that had happened. And the first thing I thought to myself, and I go downtown on a fairly regular basis, I think we all do, I was stunned to read that, because I don't believe there is a single store where if you walked in, you could not be served in French.
I actually, to add to that, after reviewing restaurants for 20 years in this city, I only once encountered a waitress in NDG who couldn't speak French, and I always would eat out with francophones. And Pauline Marois would say, "Oh, you can't get served in French in a restaurant in downtown Montreal." I saw her at L'Express. I saw her at Alexandre. She went to French restaurants. I don't know where she was going. I don't know, but in my experience, I didn't.
Yeah, that's what they tried to sell to the population.
And restaurateurs are so paranoid about being busted. I mean, they pride themselves on being able to serve. I've never run into a restaurant where you could get served in French.
Yeah, and if the waiter or waitress has shaky French, at least they're trying, and at least they're doing their best.
Shaky French.
Shaky French.
Well, most of the francophones would say they have kind of shaky French as well. This is not exactly, Shakespeare's French, if you will.
Francophones also have no problem with shaky French, really. So I just wanted to get back to something that Aaron said about that ad that the government put out, which is, this is my identity, this is my language, And there's a big question that came up recently in the media, which is, do Anglophones sense themselves as Montrealers or Quebecers? Okay, so it's funny that came up, because I think an ad like that doesn't really help Anglophones feel that Québécois.
No, exactly.
Is it my mother tongue? Is it the second language that I speak? So as much as they criticize Anglophones for not feeling part of the party, the whole new situation, us and them, is only being made worse with the government's approach to this.
No question.
What are they doing to try to even want Anglophones to be part of this province? I don't see a lot. Honestly.
Have you seen the ad, by the way, Dan, that we were talking about? I need to show you this if you haven't seen it, because what it does, and it's very,
I've seen it.
It's beautifully produced. And the government, whoever put this together, goes to great lengths to show a black person, an Asian person. I mean, we're going to try to include all of us as Quebecers. Yet it's very obvious that this is not about them. This is only about French as a language. If you speak this language, you're one of us. And if you don't speak it all the time, you're not.
I would actually even disagree with that. I think I have always felt that unless you're a pure laine Quebecer, you're not necessarily part of the group. And I speak French all the time, married to French men, living with French men, and I still never feel part of the group.
Not all at the same time.
Well, no, separately,
right.
different times
Just
in my
wanted to
life.
mention that.
I'm blushing, but
I want to wrap up. We have some more stuff. I know, Bill, you want to ask a question. I'm just thinking, if I want to just fast forward, we talked about being here, born and bred here, now coming back so many years later. If you had to project 10 years even into the future, what do you think you'd be seeing here?
I think if you look at the demographics with the low birth rate among Francophone Quebecers, the growing aging population, the increase of immigration, globalization, the rise of Facebook and Twitter, I think we're heading into a globalized world, and that despite this legislation, for better or for worse, Quebec and Montreal will continue to go in a quote-unquote cosmopolitan, multilingual direction regardless of what legislation is passed. Having said that, I do think education is obviously important, and if you cut away at bilingual education within the school system in Quebec, it will have repercussions for future generations of Québécois. And I've also heard that from Québécois who said to me that they're somewhat concerned about, multilingual education, which is an advantage in a globalized world. But I do think that, you cannot legislate against this increasingly interconnected world that we're living in.
That all said, what are your favorite things about Montreal now that you've come back to it? Pick a couple of things that you really...
Absolutely. And I'm not just saying this because the great Leslie Chesterman is among us, but I think food. I think Montreal punches above its weight on the global food scene. I lived in New York, I lived in Paris, I lived in London, I lived in Istanbul, I lived in great food cities, and there's something very special about Montreal when it comes to kind of the alchemy of French and English and immigrants and the sort of joie de vivre of the city and how that manifests itself maybe, and low rents, which have led to a kind of a culture of artistry. And I think if you mix that all together, Montreal is one of the most exciting restaurant scenes I've ever seen in any city, both in terms of the artistry of the food, but also just the experience, the sense of, the people, this is a very warm place. I would say that. And I think also, ironic perhaps given our recent discussion, but I love the kind of throbbing multiculturalism of Montreal. Despite everything, it's like a very vibrant, mixed city where cultures mix easily on the streets. And I was worried after coming back after so many years abroad that I would find it kind of stultifying and provincial, and I haven't found that at all. I think it's like a really international city in the outlook of most people. So, some people would say that Montreal is like the bastard child of New York and Paris, and I think in an idealized world that's probably really true. But when the weather's nice and you're out in the streets of Montreal and you have a good glass of wine and there's performance art to your left and people dancing on tables to your right, I sometimes think to myself there's very few places like Montreal. And I love nights like that, and I think that's what makes this place really special. There's also something very New York about Montreal. I think because of the political situation, perhaps, and there was a lot of capital leaving the city in the 80s, the rents never skyrocketed to the same extent as other places. And as a result, when I came back 30 years later, the same father and son who were manning the restaurant 30 years ago were still standing in the same place. And I love that sort of Seinfeld-esque aspect of the city, Fairmount and Saint-Viateur. I mean, there's a really kind of New York-y vibe to Montreal.
I just want to point out that Dan and I were talking about this before we started, which is a great advantage too that Dan has is that because he is bilingual, because he speaks French so well, he gets a chance to really understand and get to live in the city and understand the culture. And I do think if there's one thing I could maybe chastise the English community on is there are too many people who separate themselves from the wonderful, unique culture of what's in Quebec. And a big problem is, and that's about the language. I'm for everything I can say about defending English, I will say if you do not speak French, you will not know this city the way that you do. And I think for you that's been a huge advantage, and I recommend that everybody, if you want to go deep into Quebec and Montreal, you got to speak French.
Agreed.
I couldn't agree more, and I would actually urge you to have like a young Quebecois person on your show to give their perspective, because none of us can really speak on behalf of the Francophone community around this table. But no, I love that aspect of Montreal.
Yes.
It's like having two cultures and two countries in the same place.
Yes.
In wrapping up, Dan, I just got to say, this is the first time I've ever been involved in this lengthy conversation with someone where there was no mention of smoked meat, bagels, Celine, or the Habs.
We talked all about that before we started, remember?
But nonetheless, this is great.
There's a lot more to Montreal than just that.
No, but I mean, and that's what I really appreciate in you talking to us, because we bring out all the other things.
Also, I would believe this may be the first time with someone local that we have not talked about construction or cones or bicycle paths either. So,
that's true.
By the way, how do we measure up with bike paths around the rest of the world?
So I'm a biker, and I also I must have a death wish, because when I lived in London, I used to bike in London, and I biked in Paris, so I have a good comparative context. And love Montreal as I do. I mean, it's not a great. Everyone says it's such a bike-friendly city. The potholes are pretty egregious, and drivers are not very biker-friendly, and bikers themselves are kind of cray-cray. So I find Montreal
perfect.
It's sort of like a daredevil, and my poor mother is constantly kind of yelling at me for going out biking, thinking that I have like a kind of suicidal death wish. But no, I think Montreal, the La Chine Canal is. I biked down here to this, to this podcast. Absolutely beautiful, glorious day. But no, it's not the most bike-friendly city, is it?
Can I have a final question for Dan? Or I don't want to say it's a final question, but Dan, since you grew up here and you were born here, do you describe yourself as a Quebecer today?
No, you know what? I do describe myself as a Quebecer because I have to say I still think in Canada, Quebec is for me like a much more interesting place that has a particular je ne sais quoi, an edginess, and I'm very proud to be a Quebecer, and I would even say Québécois. Because I think this place has a very particular alchemy of language and culture and food. So I will proudly say I'm a Quebecer.
Take that, Toronto.
I will ask one last thing because I just remembered. We all remember Pasta Gate and the reaction, of course, when the New York Times ran that story.
Yeah.
Do you think this will have or has the same impact or will have Bill 96 as that did back then?
I think it will depend on how the legislation is implemented. I mean, Pasta Gate caused a global reaction because people perceived it as regulators over-regulating in a way that was considered hyperbolic. I think it remains to be seen how this thing is implemented before we can judge whether there'll be another Pasta Gate. I think people are quite savvy. It's 2021, and the business community has very strong voices at the moment in this whole debate. Thank you so much.
Dan.
Really my pleasure.